Flashes from the beacon fire. This was not perhaps the only experience of its kind, but it was certainly the only one to which I need refer in detail. The whole incident of which it formed a part gave me the clue to the attitude which the Eastern teacher demands of a disciple. Before all things, this attitude must be one of passivity. I have also heard it urged that it must be one of personal service. Under these conditions, it is said, the thoughts of the master become as seeds and germinate in the mind of the disciple. I cannot tell. My own offerings in this kind were limited to very brief and very occasional requisitions of the needle or the pen. A daughter must not at any time act, said the Swami, as if in her father's house were too few servants. Yet I do believe, for in some cases I have known its truth, that by the loving performance of humble offices for those above us, we may enter into spiritual and intellectual communion with them, which may bear strange and beautiful fruit in our own lives. The feeling which people of certain schools in the West devote to the Church, that mixture of perfect faith and adoring love, the Eastern disciple is called upon to render to his guru, or spiritual master. It is he and his achievement which are the power behind his follower, and the unpardonable sacrilege is a failure to acknowledge or a repudiation of this debt. Each will express his devotion in his own way. Greatest of all gurus is he who realizes most deeply the freedom of the disciple. But devotion to the uttermost there must be. And dry rot, it is believed, invades that spiritual life which seeks to base its message on itself. We had at this time, it will be remembered, become part of a society in which solitude was regarded as the greatest medium of self-development. Nothing, said the Swami, better illustrated to his own mind the difference between Eastern and Western methods of thought than the European idea that a man could not live alone for 20 years and remain quite sane, taken side by side with the Indian notion that till a man had been alone for 20 years, he could not be regarded as perfectly himself. And the contrast, though necessarily expressed with some exaggeration, is nevertheless essentially correct. To Hindu thinking, it is only in silence and aloneness that we can drink so deep of the impersonal self that all the facets and angles of our personal littleness are rounded out as by growth from within. Thus, the faces of the Buddhas in the hour of nirvana are always calm. The world in all its aspects and relations is but a childish interruption of the flow of this divine thought. Behind everything is felt to be that unutterable fullness of which the thing seen is so paltry and distorted in expression. Human relations are too poor to tempt those who have bathed in the wellspring of all such relations at the ultimate source. And this ultimate source is not thought of here, it must be remembered, as love or compassion or heroism, though all these may be roads by which to reach it, but as the perception of oneness, and that alone. I have always thought that this is the reason why steadiness and quiet and self-effacement are virtues so much more central in the Hindu conception than the more active and aggressive characteristics prized in the West. Every respect in which we, being persons, can yet be consistently indifferent to our own personality is so much gained. Under the domination of these ideas, then, it appeared self-evident to all of us in that wonderful summer of 1898 that far beyond any of the saviors made visible were those greater souls who had entered into the impersonal and the unmanifested, never to return. As Swami Vivekananda would say now and again, it is a sin even to think of the body. It is wrong to manifest power. And even in the compassion of a Buddha, there was memory of persons. Even in the purity of Jesus, there was manifestation. This last thought seems to form a common motive with Indian sadhus. For on one occasion, when our tents had been pitched indiscreetly near a pilgrim's camp, and the Swami was half-minded to insist, against hundreds of complaints, on leaving them where they were, a strange monk came up to him and said in a low voice, "You have this power, Swamiji, but you ought not to manifest it." And he at once had them removed. As to the power of silence and retirement to make illumination visible, we had many opportunities of judging, for over and over again the Swami would break away to return unexpectedly. It sometimes seemed as if life in the society were an agony to him. He grew nervous under the gaze of a number of admirers who had heard of his great fame, and would enter his boat and sit watching him, leaving him no privacy. The life of the silent ashen-clad wanderer or the hidden hermit he thought of. It would now and then seem as the lover might think of the beloved. At no time would it have surprised us had someone told us that today or tomorrow he would be gone forever, that we were now listening to his voice for the last time. He, and necessarily we, and all that depended on him, were as straws carried on the Ganges of the eternal will. At any moment it might reveal itself to him as silence. At any moment life in the world might end for him. This planlessness was not an accident. Never can I forget the disgust with which he turned on myself once, a couple of years later, when I had offered him some piece of worldly wisdom regarding his own answer to a letter which he had brought for me to see. "Plans, plans," he exclaimed in indignation. "That is why you Western people can never create a religion. If any of you ever did, it was only a few Catholic saints who had no plans. Religion was never preached by planners." As it was, in the course of that pleasant summer journey, we were always liable to hear from the servants that the Swami's boat had left its moorings an hour ago and would not return today. He might be away, in fact, for many days. We never knew. But always he returned from these lonely retreats with shining of radiance and peace, an ever-deepening utterance of knowledge. To all the disciples of Ramakrishna, religious customs consecrated by the faith of others have great significance. One of them speaks of the Scala Santa in Rome as moving him deeply. The ideal of the order, moreover, is to participate in the worship of the accustomed devotees in every detail. Thus I have seen my own master, when visiting holy places, make the same offerings of milk and rice, or tell his beads in the same manner as the humblest of the women about him. The minutest rules of conduct, both secular and religious, would be scrupulously observed by him on these occasions. Thus he onced himself with the people before rising to his own great heights. Two places in Kashmir are regarded as extremely sacred. One is Shir Bhawani, a spring at which the divine motherhood is worshipped, and the other Amarnath, a mountain cave in which there is an ice emblem of Shiva. And the most notable events of our summer were his pilgrimages to these two shrines. But we also were ambitious. We desired to be taught to meditate in systematic fashion and begged to be allowed to make a retreat in some lonely place where we might keep hours of silence and make our attempts under definite direction. For this reason, tents were brought, and we camped for a week on the edge of a forest at a place called Achabal in the beginning of September. The pilgrimage to Amarnath had been made at the beginning of August, and the Swami left us for Shirbhawani on the 30th of September. Finally, we parted from him, and our journey was over in October the 12th. Even apart from the greater revelations and experiences, flashes from the beacon fire of that life in whose shadow we dwelt fell constantly upon us. Once he had just returned from an absence, and as he sat talking of bhakti, a servant came to say his meal was ready. But we could see how intolerable was the thought of food to one who was still living on the heights of the love of God. Again it was evening, and we womenfolk were seated in the boat of the Siramata, as we called our hostess, chatting in low tones in the falling dusk, when suddenly he came in to spend a few minutes with us. The talk turned on the approaching departure for Europe, but it soon ended, and then one who expected to be left alone in India spoke of how the others would be missed. The Swami turned on her with a wonderful gentleness. But why so serious about it? Why not touch hands and part with a smile? You are morbid, you Westerners. You worship sorrow. All through your country I found that. Social life in the West is like a peal of laughter, but underneath it is a wail. It ends in a sob. The fun and frivolity are all on the surface. Really, it is full of tragic intensity. Now here it is sad and gloomy on the outside, but underneath are carelessness and merriment. You know, we have a theory that the universe is God's manifestation of himself, just for fun, that the incarnations came and lived here just for fun. Play, it was all play. Why was Christ crucified? It was mere play. And so of life. Just play with the Lord. Say, it is all play. It is all play. Do you do anything? And then, without another word, he turned and went out into the starlight and passed into his own boat. And we also, in the hush of the river, said good night and parted. One evening in our week of retreat, we sat under the great trees beside the stream, and it was of leadership that he talked. He began by comparing certain notable movements of the hour, of which one had grown daily during the lifetime of its founder, both in numbers and complexity, while the other had been breaking up into its component parts. And finally, the Swami said, I am persuaded that a leader is not made in one life. He has to be born for it. For the difficulty is not in organization and making plans. The test, the real test of a leader, lies in holding wildly different people together along the line of their common sympathies. And this can only be done unconsciously, never by trying. From this, the talk somehow strayed to Plato, and someone asked for an explanation of the doctrine of ideas. He gave this, and as he ended, he said, addressing one of the group in particular, And so you see, all this is but a feeble manifestation of the great ideas which alone are real and perfect. Somewhere is an ideal you, and here is an attempt to manifest it. The attempt falls short still in many ways, but still go on. You will interpret the ideal someday. Life and the idea. I cannot feel the longing to get out of life that Hindus feel, said one on an occasion in response to something he had said about the breaking the bonds of life. I think I would a great deal rather come back and help the causes that interest me than achieve personal salvation. And the Swami remarked, that's because you cannot overcome the idea of progress. But things do not grow better, they remain as they were, and we grow better by the changes we make in them. This last sentence has to myself the ring of the Veda, which states, we grow better by the changes we make in them. In a similar way, when we were at Almora, I remember a certain elderly man with a face full of amiable weakness who came to put to the Swami a question about karma. What were they to do, he asked, whose karma it was to see the strong oppress the weak? The Swami turned on him in surprised indignation. Why thrash the strong, of course? You forget your own part in this karma. Yours is always the right to rebel.